About age 6, I started to develop migraines, and I eventually started having some seizures. I had the petit mal, which are the absent seizures, and then I did have some grand mal seizures. By the time I was 8 years old, I was also diagnosed with bipolar type 1, dual swinging, rapid cycling. At 14, I had an emergency appendectomy where the surgeon discovered during the procedure that I had polycystic ovarian disease. Obviously, I had some insulin resistance, and that was very obvious during the surgery because I already had polycystic ovarian syndrome. So the way I discovered what my major problem was is that I was working in food service and I had an allergic reaction in the kitchen. I was sent over to the clinic. The nurse pulled out the chart and she was looking through the chart and brought the doctor in and said, "Did you know you're hypoglycemic at this point?" Because I had gained weight. In high school, I'm a little over 5'4". I only weighed about 113, 114 pounds because I was athletic. At this point, I weighed about 186 pounds. Contacted my uncle because he was the only resource that I had at that point. He, about 1992, had had a quadruple bypass, and he had had diabetes for years. And the one thing that I knew from my uncle was he was doing some sort of diet where he was able to come off of his insulin. The way I ended up on carnivore was having the digestive problems over my life. Most of the stuff that would keep me under the recommended 20 grams of carbohydrates was stuff that just irritated my gastrointestinal system. I contacted my uncle to see if there was something else that I could eat that would keep me under the 20 grams of carbohydrates. At that point, he told me that if he went over 10 grams of carbohydrates, he had to use insulin. He ran through his day and he was basically eating meat. He would have an occasional salad or something like that here and there, but he was basically eating meat. I knew about the Maasai and I had learned about the Inuits. And so I knew there were groups of people that just ate meat. I went ahead on it. And when I started, my digestive tract really calmed down, it really settled down, and I started feeling the benefits of it. I was actually, for the first time in my life, coming off of medications that I had been on because I had been so heavily medicated. It was unbelievable. I had a few hospitalizations as a teen with the bipolar disorder and things like that. And you were looking at low carb things. A lot of them were vegetables. It was, broccoli, cauliflower, just even lettuce a lot of times could irritate my system. Iceberg lettuce could irritate my digestive tract. When I went full carnivore, I always just say, a few days in, that what people refer to as the zero carb zen, I've learned that term now, just really hit and I mellowed out. I remember talking to a friend of mine, and I remember looking her dead in the eye and telling her, this is the first time in my life that I feel like I'm normal, that I'm a normal person with normal moods, as opposed to what I've remembered pretty much my entire life. Because I just felt stable. I was sleeping better too. I actually ended up having to go back to my doctor because I was on so many medications. I was on a sleep aid, mood stabilizer, antidepressants, all these kind of things. I have a congenital heart defect. I have a bicuspid aortic valve. So I have an echocardiogram done every few years. So everything is looked at, and mine's perfect. In fact, my cardiologist said I'm probably one of those people, based on my age and current condition, that I will never have to have my valve replaced. My arteries are perfect. The blood's circulating perfectly. There's no enlargement of the heart. There's no stenosis anywhere. There's no clogging anywhere. I'm not as hungry during the day. I generally eat 1 to 2 meals during the day. Occasionally I'll have 3. It just depends on my level of activity. I'm not hungry, and I just eat, a pretty large portion, and then I feel full and full of energy for hours and hours on end. And it's nice. It's nice not to have to stop. And I see the same thing in my children because they're They're a heavy meat base, kind of a keto, low carb, no sugar. They occasionally have some other things in their diet, and they're the same way. They're not like a lot of children that I see that it's like you have to stop every 2 hours and give them something. They eat a big meal and then they go for hours. So I had done the research, and of course, having children, I wanted to make sure that I was providing them with the proper nutrients that they needed to grow. Even though I was eating a pure carnivore diet, basically, I was feeding my children what I like to refer to as the standard American diet from over 100 years ago. I didn't have any seed oils or anything in the house. It was, butter, a whole milk. I would cook sausage or bacon in the pan, and then I throw the eggs in it and cook it in the grease. At this point, my son was kind of what you would consider a high functioning autistic. You could see the autistic problems in him, but he was okay. He could communicate. I figured he'd need something along the lines of special education and maybe some assistance, but I had, hope that he'd be okay. Finally found the carnivore groups because I didn't know where I belonged. And the only reason I found that is because I was watching Ken Berry, and I went to a meetup. This was, I would say, 3 years ago. I left my 2 oldest children, which include my autistic son, with my parents. They were with my parents a little over 10 days, about 2 weeks. So my dad was following the guidelines, low fat, high fiber, all this stuff. So they were using margarine, they were using canola oil and all this kind of thing. So my son was placed on today's standard American diet for nearly 2 weeks. When I got back, he had completely shut down. I picked him up at their house. He was not communicating in any way. He was laying in the floor. It was just terrible. I had to put his shoes on, basically carry him out of the house. At this point, he was almost 4 years old. And when I got him back to the house, what happened? He collapsed back into the floor, and he started just kind of flapping his hands like this, and he was rocking. And I rolled him over to try and get him to look at me. His eyes were rolling around in his head. He could not make eye contact with me, and he was just grunting incoherently. He was smacking his hands against his ears, and I knew I had to go and get a hold of the doctor. I chose the carnivore diet because I knew it was the complete way to eliminate everything that he could possibly be reacting to. And I knew I had to get the carbohydrates out of him even more. But the thing that I was realizing was that even though they still had white flour and some sugar in their diet in my house, the natural fats, the higher level of animal protein was actually somewhat treating his autism because it was hiding the fact that he was nonverbal. And that was very interesting to me. Now, I know not everybody's going to respond the same way. Not every child's going to completely come out of it, but there is something to the diet and environmental factors that's obviously triggering my son's autism. Because when you remove that, he recovers. And then it was a little stressful for me. So I thought, okay, I'll try him on some specialized formula because he was reacting to everything. I ended up having to relactate to feed him because he couldn't even tolerate any kind of formula. Very complicated process. Luckily, I have a friend who is actually she's a certified lactation consultant. You just start trying to pump and you have to do skin to skin contact to re-trigger the hormones and things like that. It's a long, complicated, involved process. My friend told me, she said, most women don't get their full supply back, but I ended up doing that. I got not only my full supply back, I had an extra bottle. So I ended up actually donating what was left over when he was done to a friend that adopted a baby. I wanted them to have something to look forward to. So I made a very small serving of a low carb dessert for the end of the day initially, to just kind of give them a reward. It's like, okay, I'm sorry, I'm taking away bread, potatoes, things like that. I picked his favorite meats and I stuck with that. I wasn't a stickler for a particular type of meat. I just picked the ones that I knew he liked the best. He liked eggs, he liked bacon and sausage, and he was a big he loved chicken. So I focused on that initially. A little bit of almond flour and a little bit of coconut flour, and I was kind of just making these cookies. I had Dr. Eric Berg's cookie recipe for the low carb chocolate chip cookies, and I don't know what size I was making. They were really small, and it was just kind of one. It was like, here's your cookie. He needed to be on the diet for 3 days before he was even coming out of the state that he was in, where you had to kind of pick him up and put him in a chair. He was just, the eyes were still rolling around in his head. He couldn't focus on anything. He was screaming. He actually had a fit and smacked his head into the wall and knocked his tooth out of his mouth. After 27 days of being on the diet, he potty trained himself. He actually taught himself how to read. What I was hoping to get back was the child I had before, and what I got was an even higher functioning, happier, more social child. Basically a normal child. There's a lot of times that you can see sort of still where he's had some problems, but a lot of times we actually, if something does happen, we actually have to tell people he's autistic now, because they don't even notice, because he kind of blends in.